Okay, so the question we're going to aim to answer today is what does it mean to be in an aerobic, anaerobic, or balanced physiological state? So, first off, when we understand an athlete's physiological state, it really helps us to understand what that athlete's greatest physiological needs are, right? So, what does that mean? That means it helps us to understand what kind of training will create the greatest or really the most efficient return on their training investment. Anytime we are coaching an athlete or working with an athlete, our aim is to maximize that athlete's return on training investment, to get the most out of what they're doing when they're doing it. So that's to say that as long as you're doing endurance type training, most training will work in some kind of a way. But really the question is, and what this aims to answer, is what kind of training will work best. So, what is the physiological state? So, if we look at a typical critical power calculator, okay, our QT2 critical power calculator outputs based upon some testing, some short, medium, and long testing, 3 minute, 6 minute, 12 minute in this case. Um, it outputs a physiological state as the athlete being anaerobic, and it looks at the athlete's critical power to VO2 max ratio. Okay, and it gives an output for that. And how does it arrive at that? It calculates the athlete's critical power, and then it compares it to the 3 minute average, which we are using as a proxy for their power at VO2 max. In terms of critical speed on the run, we are looking at, say, same physiological state output. We're looking at the ratio of critical speed to speed at VO2 max, and we are looking to compare critical speed to, again, we are using in this case, this is a 400-meter test, an 800-meter test, and a 2-mile test. We are using the medium test, so short, medium, long. We are using the medium test as our proxy for speed at VO2 max. So it's comparing the critical speed and the speed at VO2 max. So all of that ends up kind of coming into this athletic architecture model, which belongs to the great Dr. Phil Skiba, renowned physiologist and endurance coach. So when we think about an athlete's physiology, it's very helpful to map it onto this house model. We call it we refer to it as the athlete's athletic architecture. So the very foundation of the house is the athlete's aerobic fitness and durability. The house has a ceiling, okay, and that ceiling represents the athlete's critical intensity, either the critical power or critical speed on the bike and the run. The house also has a roof, and that roof represents the athlete's power or speed at VO2 max. The house has a peak, which in endurance sports we don't really worry too much about for athletes who are into road cycling or pit racing, that kind of stuff, or mountain biking. We would consider this metric, but for the purposes of the typical endurance athlete, this is typically not something that we are too focused on. And then the little guy inside is not the athlete themselves, but it's actually the athlete's ability to utilize whatever fitness they have in as race-specific a way as possible. Now, when we are focused on endurance training, the most important metric we have is to describe our speed potential. And that is defined by our critical power or critical speed. That's the ceiling of our house. The second most important metric that we have is, or it's not necessarily a metric, but the second most important consideration that we have is the athlete's durability. So the athlete's ability to utilize their speed potential over duration. Really, how large is the foundation of the house? Those two things work together to help to define how the athlete will perform at race-specific intensities. Now, with regards to the athlete's physiology, okay, and classifying them as being in an anaerobic, aerobic, or balanced physiological state, excuse me, we look at the athlete's attic space. That is the space that's defined by their critical power or critical speed and their power or speed at VO2 max. And we typically only care about the power or speed at VO2 max in so much as it doesn't limit our ability to grow critical power or critical speed. So what does the critical intensity to VO2 max ratio tell us? about an athlete's training physiology. So really what it does, it defines the size of the athlete's physiological attic space, right? So when we have a critical power, critical speed that occurs somewhere between 85 and 88% of power or speed at VO2 max, then that athlete is considered to have a well-balanced attic space. Okay, they are in a physiologically balanced state. Okay, when the athlete's critical power, critical speed occurs at less than 85% of power or speed at VO2 max, then that athlete has an attic space that's too large. Okay, and that athlete is in an anaerobic physiological state. And then lastly, when an athlete's critical power, critical speed occurs greater than 88% of power speed at VO2 max, then that athlete is in an aerobic physiological state, and they have an attic space that would be like a crawl space, so to speak. So this helps us to understand what is the biggest need for the athlete from a physiological standpoint. If we are going to take a physiological approach to their training and try to manipulate their physiology, what are the kinds of things that we can do to get the biggest return on training investment? And that's when we consider the training implications. So when an athlete is in a balanced state, balanced physiological state, then there's a lot of gain to be had, physiological gain to be had by either a base durability block, a specificity block, or a hybrid training block. Essentially, we like the way that their critical power or critical speed relates to their power speed at VO2 max. We like the size of their attic space. And any change that in that athlete's physiology, we want to maintain the relationship between that critical intensity and the power or speed at VO2 max. Okay, so we want to move critical power, critical speed, and power or speed at VO2 max together. Always, we're aiming to increase critical power, critical speed to as high as we can get, as high as we can get them. But we want to maintain a certain physiological agility for the athlete if they're in a balanced state. So we want to maintain that relationship. If the athlete is in an anaerobic physiological state, then the biggest return on training investment is going to come from increasing their critical power or critical speed relative to their power or speed at VO2 max. Essentially, closing the attic space, not by reducing power or speed at VO2 max, but by increasing critical power or critical speed. So we do a lot of work that is sub-threshold and just above threshold. And then if we have an athlete who is in an aerobic physiological state, we have a couple of options. One is what that means is that their critical power, critical speed occurs at a very high percentage of their power or speed at VO2 max. In order to get movement in our critical intensity, critical power, critical speed, then we need to get power or speed at VO2 max out of the way first. If that's our aim, then we enter into a VO2 max block. But then there are cases where we may, for various reasons, and we'll talk about this later on, where we may say, okay, critical power or critical speed is where it's going to stay for now. And in that case, the athlete's in an aerobic physiological state, so we're not going to get a lot of bang for our buck in trying to increase critical power or critical speed. So what we're going to do instead is try to build out their time to exhaustion, build out the duration over which they can maintain that critical power or critical speed.